All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. So glad you're able to join us today. My name is Amy Schultz, and I am on the faculty in the School of Public Health and a member of the M-LEEaD Center, which is sponsoring this series of talks that we're going to be hearing from today. I want to begin by acknowledging the Integrated Health Sciences Core, which is one of the cores of the M-LEEaD Center, and the Community Engagement Core, who work together to pull together this Residents and Researchers mini-series, which is part of the larger Integrated Health Sciences Core series of talks, which happen on Tuesdays at noon. Really delighted to have everyone joining us today, and especially delighted to be introducing our panel today. The topic of our talk today is Building Towards Flooding Resilience, Perspectives from the Field. And we're going to be hearing from a number of both community residents in Detroit and researchers at the University of Michigan who have been doing work on the area of persistent flooding in the Detroit area. So without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Angela Reyes. Angela Reyes is the director, the executive director of Detroit Hispanic Development Corporation, and she is going to be our moderator today. So Angie, passing to you.
Thank you, Amy, and good afternoon, everyone. Before I say anything else, I just wanted to remind folks that you can put your questions in the chat during the course of the presentation, and then after the presentation, we will get to your questions, as many as we're able to. So welcome again to everybody. I'm really delighted to be able to moderate this panel, which is extremely timely right now. I am a lifelong Detroit resident, live in Southwest Detroit, and many of us in the city of Detroit have really been struggling, especially this past summer, with flooding. So this is a very timely issue. A lot of people have PTSD. I think every time it starts to rain, people are worried that either their basements or their streets are going to flood or the power is going to go off. So a lot of infrastructure challenges in the city of Detroit that have been impacting everyone's day-to-day lives. So I'm really happy to be hearing from folks about what can we do about this? What is the situation, and where can we go from here? So with that, again, put your questions in the chat, folks, so that we can try to get to as many as possible. And I'm going to.
Okay. So yeah, I guess technical issues have propelled me in the front, which is fine. So I have been, for the past year, I've been working with partners at Wayne State University and at U of M Dearborn on flooding issues in Detroit. And so I'm going to be talking a little bit about what we've been doing and what we found out in our research. In our paper that we just published a couple months ago, Recurrent Home Flooding in Detroit, 2012 to 2020. I recommend that everyone go out and read it, but I'll be giving an overview here. So why study flooding in Detroit? Well, I think it's obvious, Detroit floods a lot, and climate change is making what is a bad situation even worse. And as we know, people, especially in urban areas, like to live next to water, which Detroit is next to water, and also tend to place sort of marginalized people in terms of society in flood prone and flood risk areas. And this is true all around the world, not just Detroit, everywhere. But Detroit has particularly unique and complex challenges. Next slide, please. So flooding is far more complex than it appears. Generally speaking, there's two different types of flooding that we talk about in a context like Detroit. So be it river or direct rainfall flooding. So we have an extreme rain event, water comes in, fills the streets, comes into people's homes. And then there's sewer backup. So Detroit has a combined sewer outflow system where the same pipes that direct water away from the city during a rain event also direct sewage away from the city. And so when there's an extreme rain event like we saw this past summer, it's not only pushing water up into people's homes, it's also pushing sewage in the home. And I think you can think of why that could cause major health issues for people. Next slide, please. So flooding in general, and I really appreciate that Angie mentioned PTSD. Psychological impacts are a serious outcome of flooding. So floods tend to happen, and then there's a sort of a cascade of events that occur after. The initial is, generally speaking, injuries, shortage of food, people lose their homes. But then it moves into things like short-term outcomes, like, bacteria and molds grow in basements and people are exposed to that, contaminated water, and then moves on into long-term impacts such as psychological outcomes, PTSD, as Angie mentioned, anxiety, depression, long-term chronic health issues, which is something that we're interested in Detroit. Next slide, please. So this tells us flooding is a serious public health issue. It's not just an issue of property. Of course, economics is important. People lose their livelihoods in floods, but I think we have to take a broader view of what flooding is and approach it as such. Detroit is a city that experiences a sort of a double whammy in terms of extreme rain events happen, and we see flooding like we saw this past summer, but it's also experiencing regular flooding on just any sort of given rain day because of the low elevation of the city, the fact that there's basements where there probably shouldn't be basements, the fact that the basements are often in poor repair, and the houses themselves are often in poor repair, just given the demographic profile of the city. People can't afford necessarily to patch up holes in the roofs. Water will just come in on any day. And this does things like increases risk for mold development and microbial development in basements, tends to persist over time. These molds and everything waft up into living areas. People are exposed to them constantly, and this puts them at risk for disease in the long term. And this partially might explain why Detroit has one of the highest asthma rates of any urban area in the country. Next slide, please. Next slide, sorry. Next one. Are we frozen? We are frozen. Okay, so with the Center of Urban Studies at Wayne State U, they've been studying hazards in homes since the year 2000. The CUS conducts home safety assessments to include basic questions about flooding. And in their surveys, they found that 45.7% of those answering this question experienced basement flooding due to heavy rains or water leaks. And 33.7% said they had experienced sewer backups. And when you put those two things together, you get 62% of households responding to the survey stating that they experience one or both kinds of flood. And this is really incredible when you think about it. The sort of the vast, amount of risk that the people in the city of Detroit are living at. It's not just a small minority of people, it's many people in the city. Next slide, please. So just an example, here's the Jefferson-Chalmers area of Detroit. As some of you might know, the Jefferson-Chalmers area is right along the river and is highly prone to flooding, given its low nature. It was previously a swamp before people started building houses there. And you can stay at that if you want. Okay, we can do this. Okay, so it's when they do the home safety assessments, they take locations, addresses of the houses, and we're able to map these points and give us a sort of visual picture of what's going on in the city. On the left, what you see is households that have basements. And on the right, what you see is, does water ever leak into the basement? These are the yeses. And as you see all over Jefferson-Chalmers, people are experiencing water leaks. And these are just the houses that were surveyed. Not all the houses in this area were surveyed. So among the ones that were surveyed, this is what we saw. So you can imagine that there's more blue dots than just this. Go next slide, please. So we sought to characterize flooding in Detroit over the past decade using data from an ongoing household level survey by the CUS. And we were trying to find out if flooding events are concentrated in specific areas, and also if housing conditions or socioeconomic factors, neighborhood characteristics determine flooding risk for individual homes. Next slide, please. We surveyed more than nearly 5,000 households between 2012 and 2020. We had addresses from these homes, and then we were able to put that with contextual data from sources like the US Census or the United States Geological Survey. Next slide, please. And so this is what we found. You can see all the dots here are all the houses that were surveyed in the city of Detroit. The red dots are the houses that reported having experienced one or more kinds of flooding in the previous 5 years. And you can see that flooding of any kind is spread all throughout the city of Detroit. It's not just along the river, it's all over the place. So it's impacting everyone. Next slide, please. What we're interested in is, like, are there significant clusters of flooding? Are there places where there's higher risk for flooding than other areas? And we found that the answer was, in fact, yes. The red dots here are areas of very, very high risk for flooding, where there's very many houses concentrated in one small area that have all experienced flooding. The blue dots are areas where there's a lower risk of flooding, and everything else is just sort of in between. Next slide, please. So we also found that the age of home, we sort of intuitively we thought, well, maybe older homes are just at high risk for flooding. And maybe, this is just a function of housing age, but we actually found was that there's sort of this U-shaped pattern. If you look along the x-axis, there's the year the house was built. And what we're seeing here is on the bottom, it's low risk of flooding. On the top, it's high risk of flooding. And yes, in fact, older homes are at high risk of flooding. But we also found that new developments post-1960 were also equivalently high risk for flooding. And this sort of tells us there might be something going on in terms of the places that people are building homes, and also in terms of the housing quality itself. And so many homes that are being built were being built during this period ended up being, for example, rental units at some point. And part of what we found in our survey was that renters are at higher risk for flooding than owner-occupied structures. And this sort of brings up questions. Who exactly is being put at risk? What are the contexts that lead to people being at risk? And I'm sort of, through this research, concluded that it wasn't simply an environmental issue. There's also a social issue here too. And part of what we might consider when we talk about, resilience or moving towards protecting people from floods is addressing this housing issue and looking at the types and quality of housing, and also, who owns the building. Now, are there ways when we talk about mitigating flooding risk where we can do things like, create policies that approach landlords of rental units to improve their houses to protect the lives and health of renters. So there's lots of different questions this brings up. And I think my 10 minutes are up, so I'm going to pass this over to the next speaker.
Thank you, Peter. We're going to move to Irma. I believe Irma is back, and so I'm going to ask Allison to use her tech. Oh, there she is. Great, so that Irma can go next. Go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you, Peter. It was great information. Irma Lee, work for the Sierra Club, Michigan Chesapeake of City of Detroit. I work with the Sierra Club started as a volunteer, just interested in water quality issues, and now I work with the Healing Our Waters Great Lakes Coalition and subgrant to the Sierra Club Restoration and Protection of the Great Lakes. Can I move the slide or no? Oh, so just briefly, Sierra Club and explore, enjoy, and protect the planet. We were founded 1892, so we're the largest, and we have 3.5 million members and supporters. Next, move pretty quickly. And again, I focus on the Great Lakes, restoration and protection. And you might say, well, so what does that really have to do with flooding? But for me, the issue is that there's more intense storms. We're seeing impacts with regard to water quality, warming. The Great Lakes are warming, so they're more conducive to some harmful algal bloom growth and also invasive species. And that when we talk about water quality concerns are also very similar to the issues that we need to, or the solutions that are needed for flooding and resiliency around that. Next slide. So here is impacts warming, flows, heat island, and even in the Great Lakes region, drought. Believe it or not, we have certain counties in Michigan who are now in drought conditions. Next slide. And mitigation for climate change, essentially, bottom line, we have to reduce our carbon emissions. And one way to adapt to climate change is nature-based solutions. Next, please. Oh, there we go. So Detroit has this industrial past, right? And even with our great industrial past with the auto industry still industries, River caught on fire in early 1970s, and Detroit River is still significantly degraded by toxins and raw sewage. It is, in fact, an area of concern. You can see this photo on the left, what Detroit River looked like, and it was surrounded by green, right? And this protected us. This is a protective measure, and it's something we need to think about. You know, we've built floodplain, and rest is one of the solutions. Next. Today, we're this considered Rust Belt with population decline, blight, renters, poverty, failing schools, and deal with these water contaminants, aging infrastructure, also which Peter spoke about in terms of lead pipes, but also just their old pipes, so they're prone to bust. They're not built for today's climate and this intense rain. We have higher water levels, flooding, and CSOs. And the thing I'd like to talk about is, oh, I thought this was a different slide. So here again, we have Detroit as an area of concern. And a lot of effort to those efforts. Some of those will also bring more attention to and help us address flooding and the outcomes of flooding. Next. So this is what I like to talk about, is this resilient future. What will Detroit look like? How will we address these water quality concerns? Well, we want to see Detroit as the greenest city in America. What does that mean? I showed the picture from the 1880s of what it was like along the riverfront, but we can do more inland as well. And so we do it. A green and blue belt, urban forest, greenways, a river walk to that we love, and we will be referred to as Fresh Coast, North Coast, and part of the Great Lakes. We'll see stormwater, fewer emerging contaminants. We will have addressed legacy contaminants. We'll have maintenance funds for the green stormwater infrastructure, which will help manage the stormwater. Get out of people's basements, keep infrastructure system, and we'll have secured and smart water systems using artificial intelligence and Internet of Things. And we'll see Detroit River delisted as an area of concern. Next slide. Oh, there we go. So this is what's possible. This is the riverfront. And you can see this is the Gabriel Richard Park. It already exists. It's right by, just east of the Belle Isle Bridge. And it's operated by the Detroit Riverfront Green Infrastructure Park Development along our waterfront and around the city. We will have more, there will be more opportunities, more ways for stormwater to infiltrate into the ground. It's not a total solution, of course, something that we should include in our solutions and in our strategy to address flooding. Next. So at the federal level, I work with the Healing Our Water Coalition. We are exclusively for good federal policy to help us with our stormwater and water quality issues and restoring and protecting our freshwater resource. So the Clean Water Act, we have to, again, these are solutions, right? These are things with other solutions, but maintaining a strong Clean Water Act is not weakened. Our Safe Drinking Water Act, our ballast water legislation, and the Great Lakes Compact, which deals with a variety of issues, but okay, I'm being asked to call in. Okay, I'll do that. Keep that chat up. But also diversions. Next. Other policy solutions really are what's happening right now with federal funding and all the debate that's going on over the infrastructure plan and the reconciliation plan. And that legislation is going to bring a significant amount of money to, and and will help us deal with our flooding issue and issue as well as our water quality issues. Next. Give me a moment, I'm dialing in. So in the state level, these are the policies. These are the policies: Michigan Safe Drinking Water Act, the Lead and Copper Rule, and the My Clean Water Plan, which I'm sure has 500 million plus. Okay.
Okay, so at the local level, these are things that I'm really proud of. Work with Ricky at ECN and others throughout the city on some of these initiatives. The Detroit Water and Sewage Department has the Green Stormwater Infrastructure and credits for businesses, nonprofits who put in green infrastructure practices. Detroit is currently going through a zoning initiative called Zone Detroit. And within that infrastructure, tree plantings along industrial buffers, et cetera. We also have a reforestation strategy. Next slide, please. There's an Office of Sustainability agenda with about 60 actions to take place to address climate change. We have a climate action plan. These things that are highlighted. The Green Task Force is part of the City Council, and there's practices to make our city more resilient and sustainable. Next, please. And so here's some examples of nature-based solutions. These are things that will help protect and restore the ecosystem. And again, this is important because it's infiltrating that water. It's going to keep it out of the stormwater and wastewater combined sewer system, but also, out of our. Look at what other cities are doing. Philadelphia, there's a city in Illinois called Ottawa that I just read about, and they moved people out of the floodplain and built significant. They've seen the exact same kind of flooding that we have, but since they implemented those measures, They see a little bit of water, but nothing massive, no million and billion dollar, damages that well, you can see this is a linear bioretention that's built along the street. So it's like a ditch, but it's more than that. It's engineered, and there's lovely planting in the bioswale, and the water is on the streets and into homes. Next. And next, and constructed wetlands. We already have a wetlands down on the Riverwalk in the Milliken State Park, and Chandler Park just built a marshland. So the bottom line here is that these practices, these green solutions, nature-based solutions, will help us to be more resilient. So it's the resiliency part of this that it was hope that that's what we begin to look towards, because we've seen, having listened to Peter, that there's some really very negative public health and environmental health impacts to flooding, and it's not enough. I mean, we really have to begin to think about how do we rebuild or find solutions to address these issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Irma, and for struggling through those challenges, technological challenges. And next we have Ricky Ackerman from Eastside Community Network.
Thank you. And I appreciate you, Irma and Peter, because you provide a lot of context so I can sort of dive into the detail of what's been going on this summer. So I'm Ricky Ackerman, I'm the Director of Climate Equity for Eastside Community Network. Just a little context for the organization. We develop people, places, and plans for sustainable neighborhood growth on Detroit's East Side. So on the map, you can see that we're focused on the Lower East Side. That area includes many neighborhoods, including Jefferson Chalmers. This is sort of where we base our efforts. We work with residents from neighborhoods throughout the area, but we're really open to anyone on the East Side. So we really look to center community in all of our programs, processes, and outreach. And this is just some of the development plans we put together over the last decade. But I really just want to move through some of this stuff so I can get to the relief efforts that have been going on this summer. So some context I want to add to what Peter and Irma already spoke about is this summer we had the initial event on June 25th, 26th, where we had really severe rainfall, 6-7 inches in a short amount of time. And it caused flooding in thousands of basements throughout Detroit. As some of those maps hint at, it's not concentrated necessarily in one neighborhood or another. Jeff Chalmers certainly gets the blunt of a lot of it, but it's throughout a lot of areas in the city. I think it's important to note, again, the difference between overbank flooding, which occurs from the Detroit River and the canals, which Jefferson Chalmers has experienced the last 3 years, really, with historically high water levels. And then the infrastructure problems that result in urban flooding, where we're getting sewer backups, street flooding that results in yard flooding, and it affects people's properties. And then another nuance that we heard a lot about this summer that I want to talk about too is we had the initial event where a lot of people had flooding, and then it really rained continuously for like 2 weeks after that, which I think a lot of people can imagine the anxiety it caused people who already had flooded basements. And then it was around July 7th where we had another, like, not quite as severe, but heavier rain event. And we then got people coming into our office that hadn't flooded the first time, but then flooded that time. And some of that, from my understanding, is that the ground was inundated with water. So once we got a little bit more water, it had nowhere else to go. So it caused a lot of strain on our system. And I think that point just emphasizes the need for GSI in areas where it can absorb more water. And some people had cleaned up their basement already, and then it flooded again. And those are kind of points I'm going to come back to because I think this is really important context to understand. So we can skip ahead to, we've talked about climate change. We're going to be getting this. We've already been getting this. And then what is ECN doing? So we were already in the process of opening a wellness hub on the east side. This is a wellness resilience hub. And we just saw a lack of places for residents to really go to during emergencies to seek resources, but also just have a place of relief year round, you know, because we all have emergencies outside wider spread emergencies. So we opened our doors prematurely because we knew we had to address this problem because so many people had experienced flooding on the east side. So we pivoted our staff. We were helping people file claims forms. We had over 200 residents come in. Most of them came in multiple times, just trying to understand the processes that DWSD, GLEWA, and then FEMA were doing. DWSD changed their process like 3 times within like 3 weeks of this event. So we were trying to understand, we were trying to help residents understand, which, you know, it was very stressful because we weren't always as sure as we wanted to be when we were giving advice. And so we were just trying to really stay attuned to these processes and help people as best as we can, making copies, making sure they had all the documentation we knew was required. We reached out to one of our funders, Kresge, who gave us some money to give immediate relief. So we were able to hire some crews with community partners from Bailey Park, and we cleaned up 35 basements with those crews. We bought cleaning supplies because we heard the city was doing some distribution, but it was running out really quick. So we were able to give out some more cleaning supplies to community members. And we're currently still in the process of helping purchase water heaters for some people who can't afford it. But through all these processes, so there's just so many things to juggle. I'm going to keep talking about that for a little bit. I'm not going to get into this yet. But it was just a lot, and there was no centralized process. People had to separately file a GLEWA form because DWSD told us we should file claims with GLEWA because they were more responsible. So there was just a lot of confusion. There was no one source. And then when FEMA was finally came along, you know, it took a while for them to actually declare a disaster, which caused a lot of anxiety because they were kind of the best hope for a lot of people to get their money that they've already spent to fix up their houses in regards to this. It was just a lot to go through, and there was to say it was inadequate is to put it mildly. And people just didn't have the access to resources they needed in the immediate aftermath to really effectively deal with the problem that they had. And so I think this was a huge thing that we need to think through in moving forward is how do we get people immediate relief? And then we can talk about the paperwork afterward, because we still have people with basements that haven't been cleaned up, or with debris still there, or the problem hasn't been fixed. So we really need to be thinking about this moving forward, about how we can provide better relief. And the impetus cannot be on residents to have to navigate through all these processes, because we are experts in trying to navigate these, and we didn't know what was going on. So I just want to jump ahead now. So the next couple maps just show areas of vacant land on the east side. So Irma mentioned GSI. So this is something ECN has been working on for a while, and I think vacant land that's come about from the demolitions is an opportunity to really leverage a resource to put more green infrastructure on the east side, especially in areas with less dense residential, where we could leverage opportunities to provide those sparsely populated neighborhoods with some outdoor parks, while putting in green infrastructure that's going to benefit the wider city as well. And one of the reasons we like GSI is because of the many benefits that it can beautify neighborhoods, while also helping with stormwater issues, providing habitat, providing trees that give a lot of air quality benefits. And I think a lot of people on this call really understand that. So the Hamilton Rainscape Learning Lab was one of those projects that we implemented that went in 2019. And this is just a few pictures from that. So these are the kinds of things where we just want to see more of that in the neighborhoods. And then another study we undertook at UCN was with the Detroit Collaborative Design Center around the Goodstock neighborhood, when we were looking about how can we leverage investment in green infrastructure for green credits to put more development in less densely populated neighborhoods. So the good stock study we did, and that there's a link on our website that I can throw in, but that helped just kind of show some policies that might help guide that so that we can see more in our neighborhoods where people would be happy to see that. And then I just want to jump ahead to the Rain Ready program. So the Rain Ready program is something that we were funded to do prior to this summer's events, but we're working with Elevate and the Center for Neighborhood Technology to implement a program that they've done in Chicago here, where we assess people's homes that have experienced flooding, and then we work both in green and gray solutions. So we're talking about backflow preventers, rain gardens, and other things to address their flooding concerns to hopefully reduce the impact of flooding on them. So we'll be doing home assessments this fall, and then doing interventions in the winter and spring, working with local Detroit partners. So that's one of the programs we're doing. And we're really excited that the city now is really calling to expand this program and put more resources into it. So we're hoping that is what we see. And then just some general things to mention moving forward, and Peter and Irma touched on these things, is that you know, after 2014, there were a lot of promises, a lot of things we heard about that were going to happen. And the transparency and communication and involvement since then just hasn't really been there. And so we have a lot of people that are not trusting in GLEWA and DWSD processes for good reason. And so I think as we move forward, we just really need to figure out, how do we engage the community, hear about their experiences, and use this to really build power in those voices in our communities to reach for solutions that are going to actually address the issues that we're experiencing. That we need to be a more resilient city, and we need to make sure that residents their basements aren't being flooded every time we have a severe rain. So I think we really just need to be thinking through these processes and how those community voices can be lifted up through these processes, as well as more transparency in what's actually going on around the planning at the city, so that people are in the know about what changes are being made and we can hold people accountable. The last thing I just want to mention is that on October 2nd, we know people are still recovering. We're having a resource fair around flooding and housing resources to try to get people the help they still need, because a lot of people don't have their basements cleaned up. And then we're going to be holding a town hall on October 12th. So just two things I wanted to know. But thank you. I'm happy to hear any questions.
Thank you, Ricky. We have about 10 minutes for Q&A. And I see, Amy, you have a question in the chat. So did you want to, Amy, to say your question maybe out loud?
Sure. Sorry, it just took me a minute to unmute.
Oh.
Thanks to all the presenters, a really informative set of presentations, and I really appreciate you highlighting all of the work that's being done around this issue. Ricky, I had a question for you, because you talked a lot about the challenges in accessing resources once flooding has occurred and helping people kind of recover from those events. But I wondered, and you talked a lot about the need to continue to engage community members, in work around this issue. But it also struck me, just hearing you talk, that there's a real need to engage decision makers in that process. And I just wondered, and any of the panelists might answer this, but what are the opportunities to really proactively work with the city to make sure that the issues of the aging infrastructure within the city are addressed proactively, not waiting till the next flood and when all the resources need to go to cleaning up and digging out from underneath that.
I think that's a great question, Amy, and I think it's a big question mark for us still. I think we've been told that the city is working on these things, but I emphasize the community side of it, because I feel like that's what's been left out of those conversations, is including those voices and including their involvement and the transparency, so that they know what's going on. Because a lot of what we've heard in the aftermath is a deference of blame. I think GLEWA just came out with their preliminary report saying that the pumping stations weren't the reason it flooded. And it's like, okay, like we can talk about who's to blame and who's not to blame, but what's our path forward? Because I think that's what people want to know. And so I don't necessarily know. I think we're working with Irma and Peter and others on a watershed plan. But I think there's more conversations that need to happen in a more open environment so that it's not just city and closed door and GLEWA and DWSD, that it's involving community voices, so that we at least know what's going on and what conversations are taking place. Because in the aftermath of 2014 and the flooding that's happened since, it hasn't felt like we really know what measures were taken. We were just told that measures were being taken.
I have a question for the panelists as well too. Living in Southwest Detroit, not only has my basement flooded several times, but as long as I can remember, and I'm old, the streets have flooded in Southwest Detroit every single time there's a heavy rain. And it's almost always under the bridges that are owned by the railroad companies. So we get anywhere between 2 and 5 feet of water that makes it very dangerous and very difficult for people to travel or to get home. People get stuck. And almost every single time you see abandoned cars covered with mud that have been destroyed because people get stuck in these floods in the streets. And we've been asking the city for decades and the railroad companies to address it. And it keeps happening. And it has gotten increasingly worse, especially after the June flood. It looked like an apocalypse. There were cars up on the sidewalks, abandoned all over the place in Southwest Detroit. So have any of you in any of your work come across any of the issues or conversations, particularly with the railroad companies and their responsibility to maintain their properties?
I haven't heard anything with railroad companies, no. But I just wanted to, I really want to answer your question, but I just don't have the information to do that. But I just want to like sort of emphasize that flooding in Detroit is not simply about infrastructure. It's not about these macro, not only about these sort of macro level things. There's also this issue of housing quality. Some homes are, experiencing water coming into the home through holes in the roof, or holes in the basement just during regular rainfall. Mm. And so I think that like when we talk about flooding in Detroit, we have to sort of take a broad view of it and look at all levels when we're looking at ways to mitigate the worst effects of rainfall related flooding. So I really wanted to like sort of put that out there, because like Ricky was saying, it's one thing to sort of look for people to blame. And, I do see a lot of people sort of pointing fingers at the city or whatever. And obviously there's a lot of blame to be made. But, I think that we also like have to look at, how we can improve and protect people individually and protect their homes as well. So that should be part of the strategy.
Absolutely. Well, yes, and I think all of you gave us a little bit of hope there that there are things that actually can be done to mitigate all of the flooding. I know Irma's been trying to get on, struggling with her technology, but she also had there was a lot of hope in her presentation as well too. So hopefully this gives.
If I can answer, am I muted? Because I like.
Oh, we hear you now, Irma. Okay, Irma, you've got 2 minutes.
Hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to respond to the initial question about what those things on the slide, right? So the Detroit City Council has the Green Task Force, and we're working with city department directors. And if people are welcome to join any of those committees and get engaged, there's zone input into what is the new zoning ordinance going to look like. The Parks and Rec has there's a street Streets for People plan. There are plans and they're looking for people to provide input. They're looking for residents to engage. Ricky, you can help me. I know you know some of the other plans that are out there. So the city is making, the Office of Sustainability now has a greenhouse gas ordinance. There are things that are happening, but through advocacy, through engagement with those particular projects, then we can give more input.
Thank you, Irma. Well, I think with that, we are pretty much out of time. Amy, did you have any last words that you wanted to say before we close up?
Thanks, Angie. No, just thanks to our panelists, and thanks so much to Angie for moderating this session. I think it was a wonderful, informative session, and I think we learned a lot. I do want to encourage those who are interested in flooding to join us for our next flooding panel, which is coming up next Tuesday at this same time, 12 to 12:50, where we're going to be looking at some specific neighborhood green infrastructure for stormwater management. It's a very exciting project, and we hope that many of you will be able to join us. So thanks, everyone. Take good care.
Thank you all too. Great info.